This lecture is our latest look at the nervous system in Chapter 9. We're going to be talking about the brain in terms of structure and function, so how the brain is built and what its jobs are. We're certainly not going to talk about everything the brain does, but we're going to talk about some of the major parts in order to get you ready for the dissection that we'll be doing. So the brain has kind of four big sections. Altogether, those four parts make up about 1 trillion neurons, right? That's a huge number. But your brain is really dense. It's pretty large for the size of your body. It weighs about 3 pounds, give or take. And so we've got tons and tons of cells packed in there. So the four parts, the cerebrum is by far the largest portion of the brain. It has two sides. So sides are called hemispheres, right? Hemi means half, sphere means like a circle or a globe. So these are the two halves of the cerebrum, which is sort of shaped like a globe. And we just call them the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Below the cerebrum, so inferior toward the feet, is a structure called the diencephalon. The diencephalon is very small. It's found kind of in the middle of the skull or the cranium, right at the midpoint of the brain. Connected to that and slightly behind, so posterior, and below, so toward the feet, is the brainstem. It's called that because it is the very bottommost portion of the brain, and it's also the very oldest portion of the brain. The brain stems of pretty much all vertebrate creatures, everything that has a backbone or has any kinds of bones, the brain stems are very, very similar. This is the first part of a fancy brain to evolve in the animal kingdom. And then the last structure is called the cerebellum. This is a smaller, it kind of looks like a little mini brain. That's what this name cerebellum means, mini brain. And it sits all the way at the back of the skull underneath the cerebrum. So if you put your hand on the back of your head, right where there's kind of that indentation at the top of the spinal cord, your cerebellum is sitting right there. So some of the functions of these parts, the cerebrum is involved in most of the what you would consider thought, involuntary action, the parts of your brain that you think of when you think about what the brain does. So the cerebrum is involved in sensory and motor function, so it detects what your sensory nerves send, vision, hearing, taste, touch, things like that. It makes decisions about motor function. It stores your memories. It's involved in rational thought, critical reasoning, making decisions, things like that. The diencephalon is more along the lines of involuntary actions. So the diencephalon also helps to process sensory information, but most of that sensory information is information that will alter your autonomic nervous system. So it will result in some kind of involuntary action. Things like body temperature regulation, heart rate and heartbeat, hunger or fullness, fatigue and sleep, your water balance, things like that you don't choose to regulate, but the brain does for you. The brainstem is even more basic than that. So as we get to older and older portions of the brain, parts that have evolved first, they have more basic jobs. The brainstem has 3 parts, and the parts are called the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, which is one of my very favorite science words. So the midbrain connects the brainstem actually to the brain. It's kind of the first structure of the brainstem itself, and it is heavily involved in reflexes. So when information comes into the brain, it can help make a quick decision and cause that action to occur. The pons takes information from the body and then relays that information to the brain. So there's no way really to get to the brain without passing through the brain stem, and the pons helps kind of evaluate information and then send it to the right part of the brain. And then the medulla oblongata is the most basic of all. It is the part of the brainstem that is regulating basic life processes. Again, heart rate, the expansion or contraction of blood vessels to allow for more blood flow or less blood flow, breathing rate and depth, so how big of a breath you're taking and how quickly you're taking those breaths. So the brainstem is really, really critically important in just staying alive. Finally, the last structure is the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is involved in most of your voluntary movement, a lot of the motor skills that occur. It's also very important with balance and posture and just kind of body awareness. So if you've ever had a concussion, particularly one where you got hit in the back of the head, you might have experienced sort of dizziness and a lack of coordination and kind of struggle to make your body do what you'd like it to do, and that can happen when the cerebellum is bruised. I wanted to show you two here the parts of the brain that we've just talked about. So the largest structure again is the cerebrum, and so all of this kind of blue here is the cerebrum, right? So the very vast majority of the brain is found in the cerebrum. It's not labeled on this picture, but this, what they have labeled as midbrain, that's a really old term, is the diencephalon. Let's see if I can fit that on there. There we go. And then at the back here, we've got, I'll make it yellow. Here's our cerebellum. They've labeled it way down here, really small. And then finally our brainstem. In this picture, let me get another color. The brainstem would be all of this green structure. And again, they're using some old terms here that our book doesn't really use. So that's kind of a general idea of where you can find the different parts of the brain. So let's look at each of those parts with a little bit more information. We're going to focus on the cerebrum, but we'll talk a little bit about everything. So the structure of the cerebrum, how it's built, when you look at the cerebrum, you see these kind of bumpy, lumpy structures. The reason for that is it allows for the nervous system or for the brain to have way more neurons than it might otherwise. It can have a higher surface area and a lot more contact between neurons if things are kind of ridged and bumpy. If you look at the brains of animals that are far less capable or far less creative and imaginative than humans, you will often see that not only are their brains much smaller, but the cerebrums are far less ridged. So the structures themselves, the lumps, the kind of high points, are called gyri. And the grooves that connect the lumps, that would be right here, are called sulcus. There are 2 points in the brain where there are really, really deep ridges. One is in between the left and the right hemispheres, and that's called a fissure. It's called the longitudinal fissure because it separates the brain kind of lengthwise. And then there's another one that separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum, and that's called the transverse fissure because it separates the brain from side to side, or front and back. Basically, you have a front part, the cerebrum, and a back portion, the cerebellum. So your brain uses up a ton of the calories that you eat every day and a ton of the energy that's generally being produced by the food in your body. About 20% of your total metabolic activity goes to your brain, which is impressive since the brain's only about 3 pounds and you are significantly larger than that. The other structure that's important in the cerebrum is the corpus callosum. This is a thick fiber network. It's white, but it's sort of like this. You get these long, thin fibers, and it holds the 2 hemispheres together at the midline. It's not It doesn't connect every single part of the hemisphere, but it kind of holds them in place so that they don't separate easily. So when we know how the brain is built, we can learn a lot more about how it functions. So we know how the parts come together, and then we want to look at how those parts do their jobs. So the cerebrum is kind of organized into 4 different parts, and those 4 parts are called lobes. So the first lobe is called the frontal lobe, and I bet you can guess where it would be found. It is the anterior part of the cerebrum, so both left side and the right side. The very front part, right behind your forehead, is called the frontal lobe. And it's responsible for some motor functions, concentration, planning, problem solving, rational thought, understanding sound, understanding motion, not understanding speech, but forming speech. So obviously the frontal lobe is very, very important. Just kind of behind that, so still at the top part of the brain, but toward the back of your head, are on each side are parietal lobes, a left parietal and a right parietal. These lobes are very heavily involved in understanding speech, so hearing it and then using that information to make sense of it, and then forming words from it. So making a decision about what the appropriate response would be, for example, and then physically manipulating your mouth to make that response. And then the parietal lobe is also involved in skin and other sensory functions. All the way at the very back of your head, just above the cerebellum, so the very backmost part and bottommost part of the cerebrum is the occipital lobe, and it is responsible almost exclusively for vision. The thing that's interesting is even though your eyes are way up here at the front of your head, when the information that you see leaves the eyes, it travels through this optic nerve that comes back here. The left eye comes back, the right eye comes back, and they cross at this point called the optic chiasm. But they cross and then they meet up again back here in the occipital lobe at the very back of your head. So the information your left eye sees is processed on the right side of your brain, and the information that the right eye sees is processed on the left side of your brain. And the reason for that is it allows for a 3D image to be put together. If the information was processed on the same side of the brain as the eye that sees it, we wouldn't be able to create a 3D image. We wouldn't be able to basically overlap the 2 images appropriately to create what is actually in the world. So this is just one way that your brain is super fancy. The very last lobe is the temporal lobe. So this is toward the bottom of the cerebrum and toward the front. So if you put your hand on your ears, the temporal lobe is just above and in front of that. That's why that indentation to the side of each eye is called the temple, because it's next to the temporal lobe. And these lobes work with interpreting sensory information. So that means the brain gets the information and then it tries to make sense of it. And therefore it can make a decision of some kind. There's also some visual memory stored here. So once you see something, your brain makes kind of a little record of that so that it can identify it again in the future. And sound as well happens there. So here are the lobes, just so you get kind of an idea. Again, this would be the anterior, holy cow, my writing's terrible, anterior portion of the brain, and this would be the posterior portion. And then we've got cerebellum and brainstem again down here, which are not part of the cerebrum, but it gives you kind of an idea of how everything fits together. Okay, so one of the things that's really interesting about the cerebrum is that you have a left side and a right side, and each side has overlapping functions. But what happens as you age is one side of your brain becomes what's called dominant. It is the side of the brain that is mostly responsible for the ability to understand language that you hear and to use language yourself, to create language that makes sense both in sound and in context. And so that the side is different for everyone. Just because you're right-handed dominant maybe doesn't mean the right side of your brain is dominant. And there are some people who have no really strong dominant side. Both sides of their brain do this job, but that's pretty much less common. So the hemisphere that's not involved in language usually does other kind of processing tasks, like understanding things that are not related to language, understanding musical rhythms and things like that, understanding motor function, movement, and how other things are moving, understanding what you're seeing out in the world. That does not relate to language. Just like the eyes, an interesting fact is that each hemisphere is responsible for movement on the other side of the body. So the left hemisphere controls your right-sided movements, your right hand, your right foot, and your right side controls the left half of the brain. It's an interesting kind of quirk. I'm not sure evolutionarily why that is, but it's true of all humans. Okay, the last structure we're going to talk about are the ventricles. So these are kind of little caves. Inside the hemispheres of the cerebrum are these openings, and they run the whole length of the cerebrum from the front to the back, and they are shaped sort of like the cerebrum, and they're filled with this liquid called cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. It's a liquid that is made in each side of the hemisphere. So because there's a left side and a right side, we call those two ventricles the lateral ventricles, right? They're found on the sides, which is what lateral means. And they connect. So we've got lateral ventricles in each side of the cerebrum. Then they connect. There's this structure called the cerebral aqueduct. It's like a little drain, and they drain into the third ventricle, which is found kind of between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. And then the fourth ventricle, which is found under the cerebellum, kind of at the top of the spinal cord. And then they drain down into the spinal cord. The fluid is made by these tiny little blood vessels in each of the lateral ventricles. So the blood vessels secrete or release this fluid, and then it just moves kind of through the pathways of the ventricles until it reaches the spinal cord, and it's eventually reabsorbed by blood vessels in the spinal cord, and then it gets recreated and released back in the lateral ventricles. There's always fluid there. It's just constantly being regenerated and reabsorbed. And the need for that is because your brain and spinal cord are so sensitive and so susceptible to damage, it is very protective for them to float. So think about if you had a solid block in a balloon, and the balloon was just filled with air, and you shook the balloon really hard, right? That block would slam into the sides of the balloon all over the place, which would cause damage eventually. But if you filled that balloon with water and then put the block in and then you shook the block would move, but it would almost never slam into the balloon walls itself. And your brain is just like that. If your brain slams into the inside of your skull, which is bony, and it's not smooth, and it's got bumps, and it's got sharp parts, and it's got edges, it's going to be really damaged. It's going to get bruised. It can be so badly bruised that parts die. It can cause bleeding. So this fluid helps to protect the brain from injury and damage in that way. And it also has some ability to protect in terms of germs and things like that. So the CSF is really important. That is the end of our lecture for today. So be sure you write a summary that includes the major information, and definitely write 2 or 3 clarifying questions. So what things was I unclear about? What do you need more information on? Or what questions do you have that came out of this conversation? So I will see you in class. Thank you.